My name is Patricia Teller, and I'm 36 years old. Before I tell you what happened the week my husband died, and what my 8-year-old daughter did that left my own parents' hands shaking, I want to give you the full picture of the family I grew up in, because none of what happened later makes sense without understanding what came before it. I have one sister, Madison, 3 years younger than me, and for as long as I can remember, our family operated on a set of rules that were never written down anywhere but were understood by absolutely everyone. Madison was the daughter who got celebrated. I was the daughter who got managed. I don't say that bitterly, or at least I try not to. I've had a long time to sit with it, to turn it over in my mind from every possible angle, and what I've landed on is this: I don't think my parents ever consciously decided to love one daughter more than the other. I think they simply decided, very early on, that Madison needed more from them, and that I didn't, and once that belief settled into place, it quietly organized everything that came after it, for over 3 decades. Our childhood home was a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburb outside Manchester, the kind of street where every family more or less knew every other family, where birthdays were genuinely a neighborhood event and everyone showed up with a card and a small gift, whether they were close with you or not. On the surface, it looked like a perfectly ordinary upbringing. Underneath it, there was a current running through everything that I only fully understood once I was old enough to compare notes with people outside my own family and realize that what I'd grown up thinking was normal, actually wasn't. Madison was born loud, in the best and worst senses of that word. She cried more as a baby, needed more soothing, threw bigger tantrums as a toddler, and somewhere in the process of managing all of that, my parents built an entire parenting philosophy around the idea that Madison simply required more patience, more attention, more accommodation, while I, quieter and more self-contained even as a small child, apparently required less. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters. Being quiet and self-contained isn't actually the same thing as not needing things. It just means you learn, very young, not to ask for them, because you've already absorbed the lesson that asking doesn't tend to work in your favor. I remember, when I was around 9 years old, standing outside my parents' bedroom door on a Sunday afternoon, working up the courage to ask my mother if she'd help me practice for a spelling competition I badly wanted to do well in. I could hear, through the door, that she was on the phone with a friend, describing in detail how exhausting it had been getting Madison ready for a birthday party the day before, the outfit changes, the meltdown over which shoes to wear, the eventual, hard-won compromise. I stood there for a long moment, listening to my mother sound so thoroughly engaged and sympathetic toward a problem that, to my 9-year-old ears, sounded almost trivial, and I quietly turned around and went back to my room and practiced my spelling words alone at my desk. I don't think that moment, on its own, damaged me. But it was one of hundreds like it, small and easy to dismiss individually, that added up, over years, into a very clear internal map of where I stood in that house. By the time I reached my teenage years, the pattern had become entirely explicit, even if nobody in the family would have described it that way if you'd asked them directly. Madison got a car for her 17th birthday, a genuinely nice one, purchased with what I later learned was a significant chunk of my parents' savings. When I turned 17 2 years earlier, I got a second-hand bicycle and a part-time job at a local bakery that my father had helped me arrange, along with a clear expectation that I'd be saving toward my own car myself. I want to be fair here and say that I don't think that expectation, on its own, was unreasonable. Plenty of parents raise children who work for what they want, and there's real value in that. What made it feel unfair wasn't the expectation itself. It was the fact that the exact same expectation simply never got applied to my sister, not once, for anything, ever. If you're the kind of person who believes that patience and quiet strength eventually get their due, that the people who spend their whole lives being underestimated tend to come out stronger on the other side, in ways the people who underestimated them never see coming, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel was built for. If that sounds like you, take a second and hit subscribe on Quiet Karma Stories before I keep going, because this particular story has one of the sharpest, most satisfying turns I've ever told on this channel, and you're going to want to be here for what happens later. I went on to study nursing at university, a decision that felt, at the time, like a quiet act of self-definition, something entirely my own, chosen without any financial cushion from my parents beyond the same modest support they'd have technically offered either of us. Madison, meanwhile, drifted through a series of shorter courses and gap periods, always with a safety net beneath her that never once had to catch me, because nobody had ever built one under me in the first place. I graduated, found steady work at a hospital outside London, and slowly, carefully, began building an independent life that had almost nothing to do with the family I'd grown up in, not out of anger, not yet, but simply because independence had always been the only path actually available to me. It was during those years, working long hospital shifts and slowly finding my footing as an adult, that I met the man who would eventually become my husband, a quiet, steady, endlessly patient man named Michael, who noticed things about me that I hadn't realized anyone had ever bothered to notice before, including, it would turn out, far more about my family than I understood at the time. What I didn't know then, sitting across from him on our second date in a small cafe near the hospital, laughing about nothing in particular, was that Michael was going to spend the rest of our life together quietly, carefully, making absolutely sure that the pattern I'd grown up inside of would never again have the power to take something from me without a fight, a promise he would end up keeping in a way none of us could have predicted, sooner and more painfully than either of us ever wanted. Michael and I married 2 years after that first date in the cafe near the hospital, in a small ceremony that included maybe 40 guests, most of them friends and colleagues from my nursing years and a handful of people from Michael's side, since his own family was smaller and more spread out than mine. My parents came, along with Madison, and I remember standing at the front of that little chapel, watching them take their seats, and feeling a strange, familiar flicker of something I couldn't quite name, a hope, maybe, that this occasion, so clearly and entirely mine, might finally be the thing that shifted the old pattern, even slightly. It didn't, not really. My mother spent a good portion of the reception talking to other guests about how she hoped Madison would find someone just as wonderful soon. But I'd grown practiced, by that point, at not letting those moments land as hard as they once would have, and Michael, somehow, always seemed to notice exactly when I needed a hand quietly finding mine under a table, without me ever having to ask. That, more than almost anything else, was what made Michael who he was. He paid attention. Not in a performative way, not in a way designed to be noticed and praised for it, but in a quiet, consistent way that slowly, over years, became the steadiest thing in my life. He worked as a structural surveyor for a firm outside London, methodical and detail-oriented in exactly the way his job required, and he brought that same careful attentiveness into our marriage, into the way he ran our finances, into the way he eventually became a father. We bought our first house together 4 years into the marriage, a modest 3-bedroom semi-detached place about 40 minutes outside London, close enough for both our commutes but far enough to have a proper garden, something Michael had wanted badly, having grown up in a flat with no outdoor space of his own. We built a genuinely stable financial life together over those years, unglamorous but solid, steady savings, a manageable mortgage, a small investment portfolio Michael managed himself with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. I remember him sitting at the kitchen table some evenings with his laptop and a cup of tea, quietly reviewing our accounts, occasionally reading me some detail out loud, not because he needed my input on the specifics, but because he genuinely wanted me to feel like a full partner in every part of our life together, financial included, something I hadn't fully realized, until I had it, that I'd never actually experienced before, not even within my own family growing up. Our daughter, Lily, was born 5 years into our marriage, and I don't think either of us was fully prepared for how completely she was going to reorganize our entire sense of what mattered. Michael, in particular, became a different version of himself around her almost instantly, the careful, methodical man I'd married turning, in the space of a single hospital room, into someone who could spend 45 uninterrupted minutes making increasingly elaborate faces just to hear her laugh, who kept a small notebook in his jacket pocket for the first year of her life just to jot down funny things she did, phrases she started using, milestones he didn't want to risk forgetting. I remember one evening in particular, when Lily was around 4, that I've thought back to often in the years since, for reasons that only became clear much later. We were in the garden, the three of us, on one of those long, unhurried summer evenings that only seem to happen a handful of times each year in England, and Michael was teaching Lily how to plant a small row of sunflower seeds along the back fence, explaining to her, with far more scientific detail than a 4-year-old strictly needed, exactly how the seeds would grow toward the sun over the following weeks. I sat on the back step watching them, and Michael looked up at one point, caught me watching, and said something I've never forgotten, though I didn't fully understand at the time how much weight it actually carried. He said, "I want her to grow up knowing that the people who are supposed to show up for her, actually show up. Every time. No exceptions." I laughed a little and told him that was a lot of philosophy for a row of sunflower seeds, and he just smiled and went back to showing Lily how deep to press each seed into the soil. It was around that same period that Michael started taking a more active, deliberate interest in our estate planning, not in a morbid way, not with any sense that something was wrong, but simply as part of his broader instinct toward careful, methodical preparation. He'd mention it occasionally, almost offhandedly, usually after some news story about a family dispute over an inheritance, or after hearing, secondhand through me, another small detail about how my own parents had handled things with Madison versus how they'd handled things with me over the years. He started working with a solicitor to properly formalize our will, our life insurance arrangements, the legal structure around our house and savings, thorough, unhurried work that took the better part of a year to fully complete, work that felt, at the time, like simple responsible adulting, the kind of thing sensible parents are supposed to do once they have a child depending on them. I didn't think much, in those years, about how specifically Michael had structured any of it. I trusted him completely with our finances, the same steady trust I'd built with him about nearly everything else in our marriage, and I signed whatever documents needed signing without reading every clause with the kind of scrutiny he brought to them, because that scrutiny was, in a sense, his particular gift to our family, the quiet, careful vigilance that let me focus on the parts of our life I was better suited to focus on, while he handled the parts he was better suited to handle. Lily grew into a bright, observant, slightly serious little girl, more like her father in temperament than like me, with the same habit of noticing small details other people missed and the same quiet, careful way of thinking things through before she spoke. By the time she was 7, she'd started asking increasingly pointed questions about her grandparents, why we saw her Aunt Madison's family so much more often than we saw my parents, why certain birthdays and holidays seemed to always work out for everyone except us. I remember giving her careful, age-appropriate versions of the truth during those conversations, trying hard not to poison her against people who were, after all, still technically her family, even as some old, familiar ache resurfaced in me each time she asked. None of us, not me, not Michael, and certainly not Lily, had any idea, during those quiet, contented years of sunflower seeds and careful estate planning and long summer evenings in the garden, how soon and how completely that careful preparation Michael had spent years quietly building was about to become the single most important thing he'd ever done for the two people he loved most. The morning it happened started out so ordinary that I've spent countless hours since trying to remember every small detail of it, as though holding on to the mundane specifics might somehow soften what came after. It was a Tuesday in late October. Michael left for work a little earlier than usual because he had a site inspection scheduled outside the city, kissing the top of Lily's head as she ate her cereal, telling her to have a good day at school, telling me, as he always did, that he'd see me that evening. Ordinary words. The kind you say 1,000 times without ever once considering they might be the last version of them you get to say. I was at the hospital for a day shift when I got the call, a little after 2 in the afternoon. I remember exactly where I was standing, in the corridor outside the nurse's station, holding a chart I'd been about to file, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and something in me, some instinct I've never been able to fully explain, made me answer it immediately instead of letting it go to voicemail the way I normally would have during a shift. It was a paramedic on the other end, his voice careful and measured in the specific way medical professionals learn to deliver news that can't be softened no matter how gently it's phrased. There had been a car accident on the motorway, a lorry that had jackknifed in heavy rain, multiple vehicles involved. Michael's car had been one of them. He explained, as clearly as he could, that Michael had been taken to the nearest hospital, and that I should come as soon as I was able to. I don't remember most of the drive there. I remember a colleague insisting on taking me, because my hands were shaking too badly to safely be behind a wheel. I remember the particular quality of light in the hospital corridor, fluorescent and unforgiving, and I remember a doctor, a woman probably close to my own age, taking me into a small side room with soft chairs and a box of tissues already sitting on the table, which is a detail that, even in the fog of that afternoon, registered somewhere in my mind as a very bad sign, because rooms like that only exist for exactly one purpose. Michael had died at the scene. The impact had been severe enough, the doctor explained gently, that there hadn't been anything anyone could have done, even if help had arrived instantly. He was 41 years old. He had left for a site inspection that morning the same way he'd left 1,000 other mornings, and he was never coming home again. I won't try to describe, in any real detail, the hours that followed, because I don't think words actually capture what that kind of loss does to a person in the first few hours of it. There's a particular kind of shock that isn't really an emotion so much as a temporary suspension of the ability to feel anything coherently at all, a strange, floating numbness that I now understand, from the other side of it, was simply my mind's way of protecting me from processing the full weight of what had happened all at once, because no mind is actually built to absorb something that large in a single moment. I had to leave that small room at some point and call someone about Lily, who was still at school, still living inside the last few hours of a world that hadn't yet been permanently altered. I called my sister-in-law first, Michael's younger sister, who lived close enough to collect Lily from school and keep her for the evening while I dealt with the hospital, the beginning of what I now know is an almost unbearably long list of practical, bureaucratic tasks that grief forces you to complete even while every part of you is barely functioning. And then, because some deep, old instinct in me still believed, even in that moment, that a parent losing their child's father was exactly the kind of catastrophe that would finally, unquestionably, bring my own parents rushing to my side, I called my mother. I remember the call itself in fragments, my own voice sounding strange and distant to me as I said the words out loud for the first time. Michael died, Mum, there was an accident, and then the silence on the other end of the line, brief but distinct, before she responded. I'll get into exactly what she said in the next part of this story, because it deserves its own space, its own full weight, rather than being rushed through here alongside everything else that happened that day. What I'll say for now is that the response I received in that moment was the second devastating blow of that entire day, arriving less than 3 hours after the first one, and in some ways, though it may sound strange to say this about a phone call compared to a death, it was the one that changed something in me permanently. I got through the rest of that week the way I imagine most people get through the worst week of their life, one impossible task at a time, one phone call at a time, 1 hour at a time, functioning on some automatic level just beneath full awareness, while Lily, only 8 years old, tried to make sense of a loss so enormous that even the adults around her were visibly struggling to process it. She asked me, the first night, lying beside me in our bed because neither of us could bear the thought of her sleeping alone in her own room, whether her daddy was coming back. I told her the truth, as gently as I knew how, and I remember her going very quiet afterward, not crying immediately the way I expected, but simply lying very still, processing something too large for an 8-year-old's understanding to fully hold all at once, a stillness that reminded me, in a way that broke my heart all over again, of exactly the way her father used to go quiet and thoughtful before he said something important. I had no idea, in the middle of that unbearable week, that my daughter's quiet, careful mind was already, in its own way, beginning to hold on to something her father had left behind specifically for a moment just like this one, though it would be several more days before any of us fully understood what that something actually was. I want to take you back to that moment, standing in a corridor outside the small side room the hospital had put me in, my hands still shaking. The word died barely out of my mouth for the first time in my life, because I've replayed this exact call in my mind so many times since that I could probably recite it word for word, in order, without missing a single line. There was a pause after I told my mother, brief but unmistakable, the kind of pause that, even in the middle of my own shock, registered as strange. I expected an immediate reaction, a gasp, tears, my mother's voice breaking the way I imagine any mother's voice would break hearing that her daughter's husband had just died in a car accident. What I got instead was a beat of silence, and then her voice, careful in a way I couldn't quite place at the time but understand perfectly now, in hindsight, as the sound of someone doing rapid mental calculations about their own schedule. "Oh, Patricia," she said. "That's terrible. That's just terrible." And then, after another short pause, she asked, "When did this happen?" I told her it had happened that afternoon, just hours earlier, that I was still at the hospital, that I hadn't even fully absorbed it myself yet. And it was in the silence that followed that question, the specific quality of that silence, that I first felt something shift inside me, a small, cold, unfamiliar clarity cutting through the fog of shock, the sense that whatever came next in this conversation was going to matter more than almost anything else that had happened that entire day. "We're actually right in the middle of Madison's birthday dinner," my mother said. "We've got everyone here, her in-laws, the whole extended family. It would be very difficult for us to leave right now, in the middle of everything." She said this, I want to be clear, not coldly, not cruelly in tone, but almost apologetically, the way you'd explain to a colleague why you couldn't cover an extra shift, a logistical inconvenience rather than an emergency requiring an immediate, unconditional response. I remember asking her, my voice barely holding together, whether she understood what I just told her, that Michael was dead, that Lily had lost her father, that I was standing in a hospital corridor completely alone. She said, yes, of course she understood, and that it was awful, genuinely awful, but that Madison had been planning this dinner for weeks, that people had traveled for it, that it would be terribly disruptive to simply leave in the middle of the main course. She said she'd call me first thing in the morning, that we could talk properly then, once the dinner had wound down and she'd had a chance to process everything herself. I don't fully remember how I ended that call. I remember hanging up, or maybe she hung up first, and standing very still in that corridor for what felt like a long time, staring at a wall, trying to make two conflicting pieces of information sit together in my mind at the same time, the fact that my husband had just died, and the fact that my mother had just chosen not to come to me because of a birthday dinner. I had spent 36 years, at that point, absorbing smaller versions of exactly this same message, over and over, in 100 different forms. But there is a particular, specific kind of devastation in receiving the largest, clearest version of that message on the single worst day of your entire life, and I don't think anything before or since has ever made the shape of my family's priorities quite so unmistakably visible to me as that phone call did. My father, I later learned, hadn't even come to the phone. My mother mentioned, almost as an afterthought near the end of that first call, that he'd sent his condolences through her, that he was in the middle of carving when I'd called and hadn't wanted to leave the table. I remember, even in my grief, finding something almost darkly funny about the specificity of that detail, that the image I was left with, on the day my husband died, was of my father slicing a birthday roast while his other daughter sobbed with joy at her party, entirely unaware, or perhaps simply unconcerned, that his eldest daughter was standing in a hospital corridor with nobody beside her at all. Neither of my parents called back that night, despite what my mother had said. They didn't call the next morning either, not until nearly 2 in the afternoon, almost 24 hours after the initial call, by which point I had already made arrangements for the funeral home, already spoken with a solicitor about the immediate practical steps that needed to be taken, already sat down with Lily and found some way, some impossible way, to explain to an 8-year-old that her father was never coming home. When my mother finally did call, it was a short, somewhat stilted conversation, full of vague, general condolences, with no mention at all of when they might actually come to see me, and no acknowledgement whatsoever of the fact that an entire day had passed with me facing all of it completely alone. I got through the funeral arrangements with the help of Michael's sister, his small circle of close friends, and a handful of my own colleagues from the hospital who stepped in, without being asked, in ways my own family never once offered to. My parents did eventually attend the funeral itself, a week and a half later, sitting near the back, leaving shortly after the service ended, offering brief, formal condolences that felt, to me, more like the fulfillment of a social obligation than any genuine expression of grief or support. Madison didn't attend at all, sending a text message instead that mentioned she wasn't sure she could handle it emotionally, a sentence I read 3 times, standing in my kitchen the morning of my husband's funeral, before setting my phone face down on the counter and simply continuing to get Lily dressed for the day, because there was, in that moment, genuinely nothing else useful I could do with the feeling that sentence produced in me. What I didn't know yet, in the raw, exhausting days that followed the funeral, was that my parents' absence that first devastating night had not, in fact, been the last significant thing they were going to do in response to my husband's death. It was only the beginning of it, a beginning that would reveal its true shape less than 2 weeks later, when they finally did decide to make time for me, though not, as it turned out, for any of the reasons I might once have hoped for. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from grieving and administrating at the same time, from having to make dozens of small, weighty decisions about someone's death while you're still barely able to accept that the death itself happened at all. Nobody warns you about this part. Nobody tells you that losing your husband doesn't just mean losing him, it means becoming, almost overnight, the sole person responsible for 1,000 practical details that he would have handled without you ever having to think about them, from mortgage paperwork to utility accounts to a funeral that somehow needs to be planned within days, while you're barely capable of remembering to eat. I handled almost every part of it alone. Michael's sister, Claire, helped where she could, sitting with me for a few hours some evenings after Lily had gone to bed, going through paperwork with me, making phone calls when my own voice wasn't steady enough to get through them. A couple of close friends from the hospital brought meals over some nights, quietly, without making a production of it, the kind of practical kindness that means more in the middle of grief than almost anything else people can offer. But the actual weight of the decisions, the funeral home, the service, the burial plot, the endless calls to insurance companies and banks and Michael's employer, fell almost entirely on me, because there was, quite simply, no one else in my immediate family available or willing to carry any of it. I remember sitting at our kitchen table one evening, the same table where Michael used to sit with his laptop and his cup of tea, reviewing our accounts with that same quiet, careful attention, going through a folder of paperwork his solicitor had sent over, and feeling a wave of something close to disbelief at how much there actually was to process. Life insurance forms. Pension transfer documents. The deed to the house. A folder, unexpectedly thick, labeled simply estate, that I hadn't yet had the emotional capacity to open properly, sitting at the bottom of the stack like something I knew, instinctively, I wasn't ready to face yet. Lily, through all of this, needed me in ways that grief made almost unbearably difficult to fully show up for. She'd taken to sleeping in my room most nights, and I didn't have the heart, or honestly the desire, to send her back to her own bed, because some part of me needed the comfort of her small, warm presence beside me just as much as she needed mine. She asked questions in the strange, sideways way children process loss, not always directly about her father, but through smaller, oblique questions about death in general, about what happens to people, about whether I was going to die too. I answered as honestly and gently as I could manage each time, even when my own voice threatened to break halfway through. What struck me most, during those weeks, was how completely absent my parents remained from any part of this process, even as the sheer volume of what needed doing became more and more visible to anyone who cared to look closely. My mother called perhaps twice a week, brief calls that rarely lasted more than 10 minutes, always ending with some version of "let me know if you need anything," a phrase that, after the third or fourth repetition without any accompanying offer of actual, specific help, started to feel less like genuine concern and more like a scripted line delivered to satisfy some minimum requirement of maternal duty. They didn't offer to help with Lily, even for an afternoon, even once, despite living less than an hour away. They didn't offer to sit with me while I went through Michael's things, a task I eventually had to do almost entirely alone over a series of quiet, devastating evenings after Lily had gone to sleep. They didn't offer to help with any of the funeral costs, though I want to be fair and say I never asked them to. Michael, characteristically, had left more than adequate life insurance in place, and money was not, at that point, the thing I needed from my parents. What I needed, and what I never received, was simply their presence. Their time. Some small, tangible sign that my grief mattered as much to them as their own convenience did. Madison, for her part, sent a bouquet of flowers to the house about a week after the funeral, along with a card that read, in its entirety, "Thinking of you during this difficult time. Let me know if there's anything I can do." I remember staring at that card for a long moment, standing in my hallway with the flowers still in their cellophane wrapping, thinking about how strange it was that my own sister could sign her name to a sentiment so generic it could have applied to literally any grieving stranger, rather than the sister she'd grown up in the same house with for 18 years. I began, during that stretch of weeks, to notice something shifting in myself that I hadn't fully expected, a kind of clarity emerging out of the grief, sharp and unwelcome but undeniably useful. I had spent my entire life quietly absorbing the message that my needs mattered less than Madison's, that my pain registered less urgently than hers, that showing up for me had always been, for my parents, an optional inconvenience rather than an obligation. I had absorbed that message so completely, for so many years, that I'd never fully allowed myself to name it as unfair, not really, not out loud, not even to myself. But grief, it turns out, has a way of stripping away the softer, more forgiving interpretations you've spent years constructing around a painful pattern, leaving you with nothing but the pattern itself, laid bare. By the time 3 weeks had passed since Michael's death, I had somehow managed, almost entirely alone, to handle the funeral, the immediate aftermath, the mountain of paperwork that death generates, and the daily, exhausting work of trying to hold together an 8-year-old's entire sense of safety in the world. I had done all of it without a single full day of help from either of my parents. And it was right around that 3-week mark, just as I was beginning to find some small, fragile rhythm to our new, permanently altered life, that my mother called again, except this time, her voice carried a different tone entirely, one I hadn't heard from her in all the previous calls, a tone that I would come to understand, within the hour, had absolutely nothing to do with checking on how Lily and I were coping, and everything to do with something else entirely. The phone call came on a Thursday evening, about 3 weeks after Michael's death, while I was in the kitchen trying to get Lily to eat something more substantial than the toast she'd been picking at for most of that week. My mother's voice, when I answered, had a brightness to it that felt immediately wrong, a kind of forced cheerfulness that didn't match anything about the previous 3 weeks of brief, distracted calls. "Patricia, your father and I would like to come see you this weekend," she said. "We think it's time we all sat down together properly, as a family, and talked things through." I remember feeling a small, cautious flicker of something almost like hope in that moment, a part of me that still, even after everything, wanted to believe that this was finally the overdue gesture I'd been waiting for, my parents finally showing up, finally choosing me, even if it had taken 3 weeks longer than it should have. I told her that would be lovely, that Lily and I would be home all weekend, and I spent the following 2 days almost embarrassingly hopeful, tidying the house, planning what I'd make for lunch, allowing myself to imagine a version of that visit where my mother finally held me and told me she was sorry, that she should have come the night I called, that she understood now how badly she'd failed me. They arrived on Saturday afternoon, both of them dressed more formally than I expected for what I'd assumed would be a simple family visit, my father in a proper collared shirt he rarely wore outside of work events, my mother carrying a folder I noticed immediately but didn't think much of at the time, assuming it might contain old photographs, or perhaps some paperwork related to Michael's affairs that they'd offered, at last, to help me sort through. We sat in the living room, Lily upstairs playing in her room at my request, because some instinct in me, even before I fully understood what was happening, wanted her shielded from whatever this conversation was actually going to become. My mother made polite small talk for the first several minutes, asking about Lily's schooling, commenting on how tired I looked, the kind of surface-level concern that had characterized nearly every interaction between us for years. And then, without much of a transition at all, she opened the folder she'd brought and slid a single sheet of paper across the coffee table toward me. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. It was a printed document, formatted like something between a letter and a legal proposal, outlining what my parents described as a fair and reasonable division of what they called the family estate, specifically, a request for 50% of everything Michael had left behind, including the house, his life insurance payout, and his pension. I sat there for a long moment, staring at that piece of paper, genuinely unable to make my mind process what I was reading, in much the same way I'd been unable to fully process the word died 3 weeks earlier. I looked up at my father, who was avoiding my eyes entirely, staring instead at a point somewhere on the wall behind me, and then at my mother, who was watching my face with an expression I can only describe as businesslike, as though she were presenting a routine proposal to a colleague rather than asking her recently widowed daughter to hand over half of everything her husband had died leaving behind for their 8-year-old child. "I don't understand," I finally managed to say. "Why would you be entitled to any of this?" My mother's response, delivered with the same careful, rehearsed calm she'd clearly prepared beforehand, was that they felt it was only fair, given that Michael's family had significant assets, and that as my parents, they had certain expectations about how a family's wealth should be distributed across generations. Expectations that apparently included them receiving a substantial portion of my dead husband's estate, despite having no legal relationship to him whatsoever, despite not having been named in his will, despite having, 3 weeks earlier, chosen a birthday dinner over comforting their grieving daughter on the single worst night of her life. I asked, my voice rising in a way that felt almost foreign to me, given how carefully I'd learned over the years to keep my emotions controlled around my parents, whether they understood how insane this request sounded. My father finally spoke at that point, his voice quiet but firm, and said something that has stayed with me, word for word, ever since. "Patricia, you've always been sensible with money. You don't need all of this the way a family really needs it. We just think it makes more sense spread around a bit." There it was again, that word, sensible, doing the exact same quiet, damaging work that words like responsible and capable had done throughout my entire childhood, quietly reclassifying my competence into a justification for taking something away from me. I sat there, in my own living room, 3 weeks widowed, being told by the same parents who couldn't be bothered to leave a birthday dinner on the night my husband died, that I was too sensible to be trusted with the full weight of what he'd left behind for me and our daughter. I asked them to leave. I don't remember exactly how I phrased it, only that my voice was shaking by that point, and that my mother's expression shifted, briefly, into something that looked almost like genuine surprise, as though she'd expected this conversation to go far more smoothly than it was going, as though she genuinely believed I would simply agree, the way I'd quietly agreed to so many unfair arrangements throughout my entire life up to that point. They left, though not before my mother, at the door, said one more thing that I've turned over in my mind countless times since, that they'd give me some time to think it over, as though this were a negotiation still actively in progress rather than a request I had already, unambiguously, refused. My father said nothing further, simply nodding a stiff goodbye before following her out to the car. I stood in my hallway for a long time after they'd gone, that single sheet of paper still sitting on my coffee table where I'd left it, and I remember Lily coming down the stairs a few minutes later, asking, in her careful, observant way, why Grandma and Granddad had left so quickly, and whether everything was all right. I told her everything was fine, though it very much wasn't, and I remember her studying my face for a moment with an expression far too perceptive for an 8-year-old, before quietly going to the small desk in her room where, unbeknownst to me at that exact moment, she had been keeping something safe for weeks, something her father had entrusted to her, with very specific instructions, not long before his death. For a moment he had somehow, impossibly, known might eventually come. My parents didn't disappear after that first visit, the way I'd half hoped they might once I'd made my refusal clear. Instead, over the following 2 weeks, they returned to the subject with a persistence that surprised me, even given everything I already knew about them, as though my initial no had simply been an opening position in a negotiation rather than the final, unambiguous answer I'd intended it to be. My mother called 3 times that first week alone, each call beginning with some gentler, more roundabout approach to the same subject, as though she believed the right combination of words might eventually soften what I'd already made clear. In the first of those calls, she framed it as concern for my well-being, telling me that managing that much money alone, while grieving, while raising a child, would be an enormous burden, and that having family share the responsibility would actually be a relief to me, if I really thought about it honestly. I remember standing in my kitchen during that call, gripping the edge of the counter, trying to keep my voice level as I explained, as plainly as I could, that I was a grown woman who had managed our household finances alongside my husband for over a decade, that I was entirely capable of managing an estate on my own, and that what would actually be a relief to me was my family simply respecting a decision I had already made. My mother's response to that was a short, almost dismissive laugh, followed by, "There's no need to get so defensive about it, Patricia. We're only trying to help." The second call, a few days later, shifted tactics entirely, moving away from concern for my well-being and towards something closer to open resentment. My mother pointed out that Madison had always struggled financially compared to me, that her husband's business had been through a difficult patch recently, and that it seemed only fair, given how much they'd always done for the family, that some of what Michael had left behind should go toward helping her sister through a hard time. I asked, as calmly as I could manage, why Michael's estate, money he had earned, invested, and specifically willed to his wife and daughter, should have anything at all to do with Madison's business difficulties. My mother's answer, delivered without any apparent awareness of how it sounded, was, "Because that's what families do for each other, Patricia. Or at least, that's what families are supposed to do." I want to pause here and say something about how deeply that particular sentence landed, because I think it captures, more precisely than almost anything else that happened during those weeks, the exact shape of the unfairness I'd spent my whole life inside of. My mother was invoking the language of family loyalty and sacrifice at the exact moment she was asking me to sacrifice something for a sister who had sent a generic sympathy card and then vanished, while she herself had chosen a birthday dinner over comforting me on the worst night of my life. The word family, in my mother's mouth, had never actually meant mutual obligation. It had always meant something closer to a one-directional flow, always running from me toward Madison, never once, in 36 years, running back the other way. My father called once during that stretch, a shorter, more awkward conversation than any I'd had with my mother, in which he mostly avoided directly repeating her arguments and instead focused on a different, somehow even more painful angle. He told me that he worried I might make impulsive decisions with a large sum of money while I was still grieving, that people in emotional distress sometimes made choices they regretted later, and that having family involved in the process would help ensure the money was handled wisely. I asked him, directly, what specific evidence he had that I was likely to handle Michael's estate irresponsibly, given that I had a stable career, a decade of experience managing our joint finances, and had never, in my entire adult life, given either of my parents a single reason to doubt my financial judgment. He didn't have an answer to that. He simply repeated, a little more quietly, that he just wanted to make sure everything was handled properly, a phrase so vague and so clearly unsupported by anything I'd actually done that it told me everything I needed to know about how little the actual argument mattered to either of them, compared to the outcome they wanted. By the end of that second week, I had started keeping a written record of these calls, dates, times, rough summaries of what was said, a habit I didn't fully examine the reasoning behind at the time, beyond a vague, defensive instinct that I might need it later. I also, during that same stretch, finally worked up the emotional strength to open the thick folder labeled estate that Michael's solicitor had sent over weeks earlier, the one I'd been avoiding since the week of the funeral, unable to face the practical finality of what it represented. What I found inside that folder, sitting alone at our kitchen table one evening after Lily had gone to sleep, was more thorough and more carefully constructed than I could have possibly anticipated, a will that had clearly been drafted with an unusual degree of specificity and foresight, along with a sealed letter, addressed to me, in Michael's own handwriting, that the solicitor's covering note explained had been left with very particular instructions about exactly when and how it should eventually be delivered. I sat there for a long time before I finally opened it, some instinct in me sensing, correctly, that whatever was written inside was about to explain far more than I'd realized about the quiet, careful preparations my husband had been making, for years, without ever fully telling me the details, preparations that, as it turned out, had anticipated almost exactly the situation I now found myself in, down to details so precise that reading them, for the first time, felt less like discovering a surprise and more like finally understanding a plan that had been carefully, lovingly assembled around me long before I ever needed it. The letter was 3 pages long, written in Michael's careful, slightly slanted handwriting, the same handwriting I'd seen on 1,000 shopping lists and birthday cards over the years, though nothing about the weight of what was written on these particular pages resembled anything ordinary at all. I sat at our kitchen table that evening with my tea going cold beside me, and I read it slowly, twice through, because the first time, I don't think I fully absorbed what I was reading. He began by telling me he hoped, more than anything, that I was never actually reading this letter, that he'd written it, as his solicitor would explain, purely as a precaution, the kind of careful, methodical preparation he'd always brought to everything in our life together, and that if I was reading it now, it meant something had happened to him far sooner than either of us would have wanted, and he was deeply, achingly sorry for that, sorry to not be there, sorry to be leaving Lily and me to face whatever came next without him physically beside us. But the letter wasn't only, or even mostly, a letter of grief and apology. What followed, across the next 2.5 pages, was something closer to a strategic briefing, and reading it, I finally began to understand exactly how much quiet, careful thought Michael had put, over years, into protecting me from a situation he had apparently anticipated with an accuracy that still, even now, takes my breath away. He wrote that over the course of our marriage, he had listened carefully, again and again, to the small details I'd shared with him about my family, not just the obvious, painful moments, but the accumulated weight of 1,000 smaller ones, the birthday bicycle versus the birthday car, the spelling competition nobody helped me study for, the university years I'd funded almost entirely alone while Madison drifted through life with a safety net beneath her that never once extended to me. He wrote that he had come to understand, long before I fully articulated it to myself, that my parents' sense of fairness operated on a deeply skewed internal logic, one where my competence was treated as a reason to give me less rather than more, and he had made a quiet, deliberate decision, years earlier, that he was not going to let that same logic extend its reach into whatever he eventually left behind for Lily and me. To that end, he explained, he had structured our will and our estate with unusual specificity, working closely with his solicitor to ensure that everything, the house, his life insurance, his pension, our savings, was explicitly and irrevocably designated for me and for Lily alone, with language specifically constructed to leave no ambiguity, no legal opening, for any outside party to make a claim against it, regardless of the reasoning they might eventually offer. He wrote that he'd made this decision not out of any animosity toward my parents, but simply out of a clear-eyed understanding of the pattern he'd watched play out, secondhand, throughout our entire relationship, and a determination that Lily was never going to grow up learning the same lesson I had, that showing up quietly and asking for nothing made you less deserving of protection, not more. And then, on the final page, came the detail that changed everything about how I understood the weeks that had just passed. Michael wrote that some months earlier, during a period when tensions with my family had flared briefly over an unrelated matter, he had made a decision he described as not something I'm entirely proud of, but something I don't regret. During one particularly difficult phone call between myself and my mother, a call I remembered clearly, one that had upset me badly enough that Michael had sat with me afterward for over an hour while I cried, he had, without my knowledge, begun recording our household phone line during calls involving my parents, a decision he'd made, he explained, after watching me come off call after call visibly wounded by things said to me that my parents would later, when confronted, deny having said at all. He wrote that he'd continued this practice quietly, intermittently, over the following months, not out of any dramatic sense of building a legal case, but simply as a form of protection, a way of ensuring that if my parents' pattern of behavior ever escalated into something that actually affected Lily or me materially, a dispute over money, an attempt to interfere with decisions that were rightfully ours, there would exist an objective, undeniable record of exactly what had been said, rather than the shifting, always favorable to them version of events I'd spent my whole life being gaslit into accepting. The final entry in that ongoing, quiet collection of recordings, Michael's letter explained, had been made on the very day he died, a call he had, in fact, been present for, sitting beside me at the kitchen table that Tuesday morning before he'd left for his site inspection, phone recording app running discreetly in his jacket pocket, capturing a conversation between me and my mother about entirely unrelated logistics for an upcoming family gathering, a conversation that happened to include, almost in passing, several remarks from my mother about how Madison had always needed more support and how I'd never really needed anyone's help with anything, remarks that, on their own, might have meant little, but that, combined with everything else Michael had quietly gathered and preserved, painted an unmistakably clear picture of exactly the dynamic he'd spent years watching from the outside. He instructed, in the final lines of that letter, that all of these recordings had been saved to a small, encrypted drive, and that he had given a copy of that drive, along with very specific, careful instructions, to someone he trusted completely to keep it safe and to know exactly when it needed to be used, someone whose small, careful hands he trusted, he wrote, with a kind of quiet, aching tenderness, more than almost anyone else in the world. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after finishing the letter, tears finally falling freely for the first time in days, understanding, with a clarity that felt almost overwhelming, that my husband had spent the final months of his life quietly, carefully building a shield around Lily and me, anticipating a fight he would never live to see happen, and trusting, with a faith that humbled me completely, that our 8-year-old daughter would somehow, when the moment finally came, know exactly what to do with what he'd left in her keeping. After reading Michael's letter, I understood I needed to speak with Lily, carefully and gently, about whatever it was her father had entrusted to her. I found her the next afternoon in her room, sitting cross-legged on her bed with a small wooden box in her lap, one I recognized vaguely as a keepsake box Michael had given her a couple of years earlier for her birthday, the kind of thing I'd assumed simply held hair clips and small trinkets, nothing I'd ever thought to look inside. I sat down on the edge of her bed and asked her, as gently as I could, whether her daddy had ever given her something special to keep safe, something important. She looked up at me with an expression that was so purely her father's, thoughtful, careful, weighing exactly how much to say, that it took my breath away for a moment before she even answered. She nodded and opened the box, and inside, beneath a folded drawing she'd made for him that past summer, was a small USB drive and a sealed envelope with my name written on the front in Michael's handwriting, along with a second, smaller envelope that simply read, in his writing, "For Grandma and Granddad, from Lily." She explained to me, in the careful, slightly formal way she sometimes spoke when she was repeating something she'd memorized precisely, that her daddy had sat her down one evening about 4 months before he died and told her that he was giving her something very important to keep safe, something she should never tell anyone about, not even me, unless a very specific thing happened. He told her that if Grandma and Granddad ever came to the house and tried to ask for money that belonged to her and me, she should get the small envelope from her box and give it to them herself, and that she'd know if that moment had arrived, because it would feel, in her words, repeating what he'd apparently told her, like they're being unfair to Mummy in a way that isn't right. I sat there holding that small sealed envelope, overwhelmed by the sheer, careful foresight of what my husband had done, not just protecting us legally and financially, but preparing our 8-year-old daughter, gently and without frightening her, to be the one to deliver the truth, at exactly the moment it needed delivering, in a way that neither of us could have staged with anywhere near the same devastating clarity. My parents called again 2 days later, my mother's voice once more carrying that same falsely bright, falsely reasonable tone, suggesting we try again to have a proper conversation, this time over Sunday lunch at their house, a neutral setting, she said, where we could all speak calmly. Against my better judgment, but wanting, I think, to finally close this chapter one way or another, I agreed, and Lily, when I told her where we were going, asked quietly whether she could bring her box. We arrived on Sunday to find the table set more formally than usual, my mother clearly having prepared for this conversation with the same rehearsed care she'd brought to the first one, my father seated at the head of the table with a posture that suggested he'd mentally prepared some kind of speech. We hadn't been seated more than 10 minutes, barely through the initial small talk, when my mother steered the conversation, predictably, back toward the estate, back toward Madison's financial difficulties, back toward the language of fairness and family obligation she'd been leaning on for weeks. It was in the middle of that speech, while my mother was mid-sentence explaining, once again, why it was only reasonable for them to receive a substantial share of what Michael had left behind, that Lily quietly got up from her chair, walked around the table to where my parents were sitting, and pulled the small envelope out of the box she'd brought with her, holding it out toward them with both hands, the way a much younger child might present a drawing they were proud of. "That's why you came, right?" she said, her voice clear and steady in a way that seemed to startle everyone at the table into complete silence, including me. "Daddy said you'd come for this eventually." My mother took the envelope automatically, some old instinct making her accept whatever a grandchild was handing her, and I watched her expression shift, confused at first, as she opened it and began to read. Inside was a short, typed note from Michael's solicitor, prepared in advance and included at Michael's specific instruction, explaining plainly that the estate had been structured with full legal protection against any outside claims, and that any further attempts to pursue a share of it would be met with the release of a series of recorded phone calls, recordings that, the note specified, included the conversation from the day of Michael's death, in which my mother had explained her decision to prioritize Madison's birthday dinner over her daughter's husband's death, and several subsequent calls in which both my parents had made their intentions regarding the estate explicit. I watched my mother's hands begin to shake as she read, the paper trembling visibly enough that my father leaned over to see what had caused such a sudden, total shift in her expression. When he finished reading it himself, his face went through several distinct changes in the space of just a few seconds, confusion, then something like dawning horror, then a kind of stricken, wordless silence that neither of them seemed able to break. "You recorded us," my mother finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, and I found myself, for possibly the first time in my entire life, feeling no urge whatsoever to soften what came next, no old instinct to manage her feelings before my own. "Michael did," I said. "Because he watched, for over a decade, how you talked to me, and how differently you talked about Madison, and he wanted to make sure that if this exact moment ever came, I wouldn't have to just take your word against mine, the way I always have." Neither of them said anything further for a long moment. My father set the letter down on the table very carefully, as though it might shatter, and my mother simply sat there, staring at her own hands, the same hands that were still, faintly, trembling, while Lily climbed quietly back into her chair beside me, apparently satisfied, in the clear, uncomplicated way children often are, that she had done exactly what her father had asked of her, and that whatever happened next was, once again, something the adults would have to sort out on their own. Nobody said very much for a long time after Lily handed over that envelope. My father eventually broke the silence, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, asking whether I actually intended to release the recordings, whether this was some kind of threat I planned to follow through on regardless of what happened next. I told him the truth, which was that Michael's instructions had been clear and specific. The recordings existed purely as protection, a deterrent rather than a weapon, and that as long as they dropped the claim on the estate entirely and never raised the subject again, nothing would ever be released, to anyone, for any reason. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It never had been. It was simply the end of a pattern I had spent 36 years living inside of, finally, undeniably, on the record. My mother didn't say much at all that afternoon. She sat very still, the letter from the solicitor still resting on the table in front of her, and when she finally did speak, it wasn't an apology, not really, it was closer to a kind of stunned, half-formed attempt to explain herself, something about how she'd never meant for me to feel the way I apparently felt, how she'd always assumed I understood that Madison simply needed more, that this had never been about loving me less. I remember listening to that explanation and feeling, for the first time in longer than I could recall, no need at all to soften my own reaction to make her more comfortable. I told her, calmly, that intention didn't erase impact, that whether or not she'd meant to make me feel like an afterthought for 36 years, that was, undeniably, exactly what she had done, and that I was no longer willing to spend my own limited time and energy managing her feelings about that fact. We left shortly after that conversation, and my parents did not pursue the estate claim any further. The legal side of things concluded quietly, without any need for a formal dispute, since the will Michael had constructed was, exactly as his letter promised, entirely airtight, leaving no legal ground for any outside claim to stand on in the first place. The recordings themselves were never released publicly, exactly as I'd told my father. They remained, and still remain, in a secure file, a quiet, permanent piece of leverage I've never needed to use again, because the message, once delivered that Sunday afternoon, seemed to finally, fully land. What changed after that, more than any legal outcome, was the shape of my relationship with my parents going forward. I didn't cut them off entirely, though there were moments in the weeks that followed when I seriously considered it. What I did instead was something I'd never once managed to do throughout my entire life before that. I set clear, specific boundaries, and I held them, without guilt, without the old reflexive need to soften every difficult conversation into something more palatable for everyone else's comfort. I told them, plainly, that our relationship going forward would depend entirely on their willingness to treat Lily and me with the same basic consideration they'd always extended automatically to Madison, and that I was no longer available to absorb being treated as an afterthought simply because I'd spent my whole life being capable enough not to complain about it. My relationship with Madison, oddly, improved somewhat in the aftermath of everything, though it took time and a genuinely honest conversation between the two of us, one where I finally told her, directly, how it had felt growing up constantly measured against her, and where she, to her credit, listened without immediately becoming defensive, and eventually admitted that she'd sensed some of that imbalance herself over the years, without ever fully understanding its size or its cost to me. We're not especially close now, not in the way sisters in some families are, but there's an honesty between us now that never existed before, and I've come to understand that honesty, even without closeness, is its own kind of progress. Lily, for her part, has grown into precisely the kind of thoughtful, quietly resilient young girl her father clearly hoped she'd become, and I think often, still, about the extraordinary trust he placed in her, an 8-year-old, asked to carry something enormously important without fully understanding its full weight, and who carried it exactly as he'd hoped she would, at exactly the right moment, with a clarity that still, honestly, humbles me every time I think back to that Sunday lunch. She still has that keepsake box. I've never asked her to give up the USB drive, and I don't intend to. It feels, in some way I can't fully articulate, like it belongs to her now, a small, permanent piece of proof that her father loved us both enough to plan for a future he wouldn't get to see. If there's a single thing I've carried forward from everything that happened that year, it's this: love that only shows up when it's convenient isn't really love at all. It's a kind of conditional loyalty dressed up in the language of family, and recognizing the difference, however painful, is the first real step toward building a life where the people around you show up because they genuinely want to, not because obligation happens to make it easy that day. Michael understood that about my family long before I fully allowed myself to. And in the end, it was his quiet, careful love, planned years in advance, entrusted to our daughter's small, steady hands, that finally gave me the one thing I'd spent my entire life waiting for someone else to hand me: undeniable proof that I had always deserved better. Thank you for listening to this story. If it moved you, please consider subscribing to Quiet Karma Stories for more stories like this one, and I'll see you in the next one.